Thank you. Let me begin by thanking everybody that puts on the Tennessee Prayer Breakfast, not just for this morning, but throughout the year. Those of us in elected office, and the room, by the way, is full of folks like that. This is a great sight to see. But those of us in elected office feel incredibly encouraged and supported by what you do. So not just for this morning, but for all the time, all of us want to thank you. You know, being in elected office is often very complex. Some issues that look simple from the outside, from the inside, there's always maybe a few more angles and issues to them. But there are some things that are clear, and when Lieutenant Governor Ramsey was reading from Micah, it's clear that we're supposed to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly, regardless of the circumstance. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. We're also supposed to be people that, whether you're in elected office or you're a teacher or you're a mother or whatever you're doing, we're supposed to be people who take light into darkness. That's part of the call of the body of Christ, is to take light into darkness. Some of us are called to do that into incredibly, incredibly dark and even evil places. We don't like to use the word evil, but there are places that are so dark and evil that you can't call them anything else. Gary Haugen, who's going to speak with us this morning, is one of those people. Gary was a star in the United States Department of Justice. I don't know another way to use that. He was looked on universally as one of the people who understood a lot of the complex issues. And because of that, he was asked on behalf of the United States government to go into some really dark places. If you remember the genocide in Rwanda back in the mid-90s, Gary was the person who the United States asked to go in and help to, as best as we could, to clean up the mess and to bring the perpetrators to justice. So several years later, in the late 90s, Gary decided to leave the Department of Justice and the next day to start International Justice Mission, which is now known around the world and I think has 700 people working around the world. But that day, it was just Gary. But Gary became one of those people that in my mind we look to. You know, my kids went to a summer camp when they were growing up, and when it was awards day, there was a tradition that when somebody in your cabin got an award, the rest of the camp would jump up and yell, "He's in my cabin," to signify that he's one of us and we're proud that he is. And that's how I feel about Gary. You know, there's a lot of times that people do stuff in the name of Christ that causes me to wince a little bit, if I could be honest. But with Gary, I feel like saying he's in my cabin, because he literally is taking light and hope to some of the darkest places you can imagine, to the world's poorest countries, to people trapped in the worst circumstances through human trafficking, through oppression and violence of a lot of different kinds, through sexual violence, to walk into those horrible, horrible, almost unimaginable situations and bring light and hope and not be dragged down yourself in the process. And so he described that every morning they as a mission, spread around the world, pray together for 30 minutes and then go to work and then pray together another 30 minutes because of just the difficult, incredibly dark circumstances that they walk into. So please join me in welcoming someone that, like I said, when I think about him, I always think, you know, he's in my cabin. I don't know Gary that well, but every time I hear about him and what International Justice Mission does, I'm grateful for somebody who's taking light into the darkest places in the world. Please help me welcome Gary Haugen.
Well, thank you, Governor Haslam, for that very generous introduction, and good morning to all of you. It's a great privilege for me to get to join you on this inspiring morning. I would like to suggest that you and I are living in an era of moral confusion and paralysis. But history teaches us two things about that. Number one, that there has never been an era that was not one of moral confusion and paralysis. And the second thing we learn is that history is just powerfully clarifying of the confusion. A lot of really good people were, of course, confused about slavery 250 years ago. Our wonderful founders of our nation were really clear about freedom for themselves, but a little confused about freedom for everybody. It's hard to imagine, but slavery was confusing. It's hard to imagine, but it's also true that the Nazis in Europe were confusing to the German people. It's true that for most of our nation's history, whether or not women should vote was confusing as an issue. Segregation was confusing. Issue after issue for contemporaries is confusing. And this is why I always love reading history, especially as a young boy, because I had this sense of drama that almost everyone is confused. There's some folks of great evil who are not confused. And then there's some people of great goodness and clarity who are likewise not confused. And the question is, who's going to win out in that struggle over time? And so I used to wonder about myself, for instance, during the era of British slavery. Would I have been with Wilberforce and those who fought slavery, or would I have been just part of the confused middle class that said and did nothing? Would I have been with Dietrich Bonhoeffer in a journey of costly discipleship during the era of Nazi Germany? And would I have been remembered as a righteous Gentile on the other side of the Holocaust? Or would I have been immobilized by confusion and fret and preoccupation with smaller things? Now, in some ways, all of this speculation feels idle, right? Like, who knows exactly what we would have done? And also, maybe aren't the truly great struggles of history, haven't they passed us by? Perhaps all the great struggles of good and evil, right and wrong, are of a bygone era, and all we are left with are petty battles in gray areas. Certainly nothing that our grandkids will end up asking us about. Now, that kind of perspective was completely shattered for me a little more than 20 years ago. In 1994, I was pretty much minding my own business in Washington, D.C., and trying to be a good civil rights lawyer for the U.S. Department of Justice. My wife and I were about to have twins, and so I'm trying to assemble these cribs, I think they're still not assembled. I was trying to trade in our little Honda Civic for a Taurus station wagon. I was trying to match wits and totally losing with the boys in my 6th grade Sunday school class at church. And I was, enjoying an occasional jog on the mall there in Washington, D.C. And then in April of 1994, you might remember, small stories started to appear about some horrible ethnic conflict in this little country I'd never really heard of called Rwanda. We began to see pictures of bloated corpses choking the rivers of Rwanda, and people started to talk about a genocide. But like much of the great ugliness that's transported to us through our televisions or online from all around the world, all this stuff seems true but not real, right? The way that stories about ancient Rome are true enough, but they don't really feel real. Or the way that statistics about how big the cosmos or the solar system is. It sounds true, but not real. Not real like my kids when they're sick. Now that feels real. Or when I'm behind in my work at my job. Now that feels real. Or when my neighbor's just been diagnosed with cancer. Now all that feels very, very real to me. But soon for me, even the Rwandan genocide became real, because I found my own feet slipping in the mud of a mass grave there in Rwanda. In 1994, immediately after the genocide, I was sent over to Rwanda. I was put on loan to the UN to lead the genocide investigation. And all murder investigations just begin with where the bodies are. And so I was given a list of 100 different mass graves and massacre sites where we just sorted through hundreds of thousands of people who'd been murdered. About 800,000 people were murdered in about 8 weeks during the summer of 1994. And for me, it was standing in that mass of horrific death that it became clear to me that the great struggles of good and evil, of right and wrong, are not of some bygone era. They are now. And it's simply my job to ask God what my part might be in those struggles. This conviction was powerfully reinforced when I left the Department of Justice to begin working with International Justice Mission. We're a team around the world of lawyers and criminal investigators and social workers who take on cases of violent abuses against the poor. And what I've now found are massive man-made disasters of epic proportions that are not of a distant history, but they're tragedies of history taking place on our watch. And I want to just talk about one briefly this morning, and that's the reality of modern slavery. Here's the shocking truth that very few of us would probably get right on a quiz, and that is that there are more people in slavery today than in any other time in human history. There are more people in slavery today than were extracted from Africa during 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. And there is a fight being waged right now on our little patch of history to put an end to that slavery. And I believe it's actually possible for you and me to do something that makes a decisive difference in this fight. And it's possible for the first time in human history, I think, to prevail once and for all over slavery. But first, let's talk for a moment just about the reality of the problem. Number one, it is vast. The data continues to confirm the extent of the problem. The latest estimates now from the Global Slavery Index is that there's about 36 million people held literally in slavery today. That's about 6 times the population of the state of Tennessee in slavery in our world. Secondly, it's not only vast, but is it extraordinarily brutal. You know, I actually keep 4 reminders right in my office of the brutal reality of slavery, because on any given day, my life can feel so far from the truth of it. I'm busy with my own preoccupations, and the struggle can be so hard that sometimes you wonder, is it worth it? And so I have a few of these reminders that just reassure me every day this fight is worth waking up for. The first is this bucket. Which I keep in my office, which has about 70, 80 pounds of rocks in it. And the reason I have this is because, as you'll see in this video I'd like for you to watch for a moment, it's a slow motion video of an undercover investigation of slavery in India. These are women who are carrying bricks on their head. What you need to know is that those bricks weigh 6 or 7 pounds. And there are about 11 to 12 of those bricks upon their head. That's 70 pounds at least that these women who wear barely 100 pounds, they have placed upon their head, and then they will walk about 100 yards across the brickyard, and they will go back and forth and do this 10, 12, 14 hours a day, year after year, for the rest of their lives in slavery. And so I just keep this 70-pound bucket in my office. 70 pounds is like the maximum. If you go on an international trip, they don't even let you carry onto the plane a suitcase of 70 pounds. Imagine putting that on your head and then carrying it all day, every day, back and forth. This is the crushing, unspeakable reality of slavery in the world. These are a few pictures just of common citizens held in slavery, even little boys who are carrying these enormous loads. The other reminder that I keep in my office is this lock. It's actually a lock that we took off a brothel in Southeast Asia. And what this reminds me of is that slaves are kept where they are on a lock that's on the outside of the room. We're used to locks on the inside of our rooms. What's it like to live on the outside of a lock, where there's no getting out unless somebody else comes for you? Sometimes people behind those doors are very young children. These are about a dozen children that I found in Svay Pak, Cambodia. I was ushered in as part of an undercover investigation to a back room where there were about a dozen children between the ages of 5 and 10 years of age that were just being sold to foreign pedophiles and sex tourists. But usually they're much older, like Chirito, but she was only 14 years old when she was trafficked into a city with a massive sex trafficking problem in the second largest city of the Philippines called Cebu. So the other reminder that I keep in my office about the reality of slavery is this notebook. It's like a little kid's notebook that my kids would have had, but it's actually a ledger that we also took from another brothel where there's this accounting that the little girls have to make of each one of their assaults and the money that was taken for it. What this reminds me of is the way this is a brutally intentional business. That people know what they're doing and they actually keep track of the brutality. Finally, the last thing I keep in my office is this needle. And it's actually a needle that is used to sew up rice bags, burlap rice bags. This is a miniature version, but a really big bag. And on one occasion, when my colleagues conducted a raid on a facility of a rice mill where people were held in slavery, this man, Javesh, he was held as a slave there, and when the rescue team came, he couldn't even go towards them. Everyone else was running out of the rice mill, but he couldn't move. And the reason he couldn't walk is because his owner, simply for his own pleasure just that day, had just repeatedly taken that needle into his leg and stabbed him over and over again, just out of sadistic brutality. These artifacts of slavery for me are a constant reminder that this is a fight worth fighting for, so that I'm not confused by the petty preoccupations of the day. In fact, I believe modern slavery is the most massive and yet the most preventable man-made disaster on our globe today. But at the moment, the forces of slavery are prevailing, which leads me to the question, why does such great evil triumph in our world? And I think perhaps the most perceptive insight about this was given to us a long time ago by Edmund Burke. And you're familiar with this saying. He simply said, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men would do nothing. All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men and women would do nothing. Is that true? I know in the case of the Rwandan genocide, all the military histories have been written. It would have been a very straightforward thing for the international community to intervene to be able to secure those places where the minority group had huddled for protection and to make sure that they were not slaughtered. But we missed that chance. It turns out that all that is necessary for the triumph of great evil is for good men and women to do nothing. And so my question is, why do good men and women do nothing? When I examine myself on this question, I'm a good person, but I miss things. Why? And when I look within myself, I think there's 3 deep sources of poverty that conspire to keep me and my good neighbors on the sidelines during the great struggles of history. First is a poverty of compassion. Second is a poverty of purpose. And third is a poverty of hope. First, a poverty of compassion. You know, the word compassion is a combination of these 2 Latin words, cum passio, which mean with suffer. It means to suffer with. I find myself drawing the circle smaller and smaller and smaller, the people in the world whose suffering I'm willing to share. And it usually comes down to this little shriveled world of me and mine. And it becomes this shrunken circle. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who you may know, was the Nobel Prize-winning writer who exposed the brutalities of the gulags in the Soviet Union. And he said there's 2 standards by which human beings measure events in the world, whether they are far or near. If they are near, they're great tragedies. But if they're far away, they become what he called tolerable disasters of bearable proportions. It's true that 36 million people in slavery in the world today has become a tolerable disaster of bearable proportions, largely because it's far away. For me, it's been the teachings of Jesus, of course, that completely challenged me on all of this. Jesus tried to make life pretty simple. He made it very, very clear that all of life was really about two things: loving God and loving your neighbor. And of course, if it was that simple and straightforward, we wouldn't have any excuse much for not doing it, right? And so he's confronted by a lawyer in the Gospel of Luke, and lawyers are always trying to confuse things, right? And so this lawyer asks him, "But who is my neighbor?" Jesus, of course, is not terribly thrown off by the question and proceeds to tell the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Where a man lies beaten along the road. Two people associated with great religious piety walk by on the other side of the road, but it is the Good Samaritan who has compassion. And so Jesus turns the question to be not who is my neighbor, but to whom do I show neighborly love when they are in need? And so which way are the borders of my heart moving? Inward towards this shrunken world of compassion of me and mine, or opening up to God's passion for the world? And personally, I have been discovering this mysterious joy of sharing His broader passion for the world, and I find that He just meets me there. The second reason I think good people are tempted to do nothing is a poverty of purpose. I marvel at the way forces conspire to bend the purpose of my life towards increasingly small and petty things, and away from the grander purposes outside myself that I sense are really the purposes for which I was made. I'm amazed at my capacity to be distracted by small and unworthy things. One of the most powerful things is to look back at the things that did preoccupy the headlines in 1994 while the Rwandan genocide was quietly going on. And almost none of those things, those competing interests and preoccupations of ours, really compete in the long scope of history. I'm also equally amazed at my capacity to wage scorched earth war over petty things, battles that diminish others and even as they diminish me. C.S. Lewis once wrote this. He said, "We must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives the deadly serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment." Sounds like Lewis has been visiting Washington, D.C. to me a little bit. And indeed, who in the midst of those kinds of obsessive self-preoccupations would have the energy and generosity for the larger battles? And then this leads me to a self-audit of small and unworthy things. In fact, what would it mean to the world if all of us in this building, not the millions who aren't in this building, but just the people who are in this room, what if we were to resolve to abandon every petty, small, unworthy battle this year, and to save ourselves only for those things that matter, to things of God, to things of His kingdom? Finally, it would seem that good men often do nothing in their time of history's testing out of a poverty of compassion, a poverty of purpose, but also a poverty of hope. To be honest, in the face of overwhelming evil and injustice in the world, and the idea that there are 36 million people in slavery, we actually can just feel so powerless. And I think that this is the deepest and most vicious lie. The idea that good people can't do anything, that things don't change, and that we cannot make a difference. Because over the last 20 years at International Justice Mission, my colleagues and I, and many of you who've traveled with us in this journey, have seen something very different. That there is a God of justice who is relentlessly at work in the world. And He is prepared to do miracles if we are prepared to step out in obedience. Do you know that at IJM we have seen God bring rescue to people in brick factories and rice mills by the thousands? In fact, we've seen more than 500 released in a single day. And then we've seen through our aftercare programs that former slaves can not only move from a place of humiliation and sorrow and total brokenness to a place where the kids can be back in school, where the adults can be providing for their families, where we've seen them go off to college, we've seen them actually get elected to office and to serve their communities. Then you see that this is a fight worth fighting. By the grace of God, those tiny girls that I found in that back room of that brothel in Cambodia were able to be released, and the traffickers sent to jail. And now I actually occasionally get to go back and visit them and see them thriving, alive, looking me squarely in the eye and talking about their future and talking about the love of a God who saw them and brought them out. You know, that Chirito, who was taken at 14 into that horrible place, is not being serially raped inside that city of Cebu, inside that brothel. She was likewise, by my colleagues, rescued and restored. She's now in college studying social work. She's actually become the extraordinary spokesman in the fight against trafficking within her own country. And in fact, IJM was able to run a project in her city that over a 4-year period of time was able to so transform local police and the court system there, which had been broken and corrupt for years, to send 100 traffickers to jail and reduce the abuse of children in the commercial sex trade, not by 20%, which was the goal of the project, but by 79% over a 4-year period of time. Hallelujah. Yeah. So when people say, oh, there's nothing we can do and things don't change and there is no hope, it's just factually wrong. I think sometimes we're paralyzed in a poverty of hopelessness because we underestimate the value of what God has given us to transform lives. Any of you who sponsor a child for World Vision or Compassion or something, you know that for a few dollars a month, you can actually keep a child alive and thriving. Sometimes we underestimate the value of a single life and his power to actually transform whole nations. You know, when it comes to this fight against massive slavery in our world, God is already showing what is possible through the faithfulness of his people right here in Tennessee. For years, churches here in Nashville have been able to support rescue operations of IJM that have rescued vast numbers of slaves. College students and students on our campuses have rallied awareness and support that likewise have been able to bring rescue and restoration and transformation against those who are in great peril of slavery. And finally, perhaps most powerfully right now, the citizens of Tennessee have rallied around supporting Senator Corker as he's introduced the End of Slavery Act, which I think is the most significant and powerful legislation asserting U.S. leadership in the global fight against slavery in the history of our nation. That's happening now. Indeed, if you feel your heart stirred in all of this, on the back of your program there is some information about how to be involved with the work of IJM. I have 2 fellow staff members who are here with me. There's a table up in the balcony level if you want some more information. But all of this is just an invitation from the God who made us, is it not? An invitation to find rescue for us from shriveled and trivial lives. To free up our hands and our hearts from small and unworthy things. And follow him in his work of love and truth in the world. Because I think at the end of the day, the God of history, he takes attendance. And he just convenes a tribunal of our grandchildren who one day just ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you? Grandma, Grandpa, where were you when the Jews were fleeing Nazi Germany and trying to come to our shores and they were actually being rejected and sent back? Where were you, Grandma, when they were marching our Japanese American neighbors off to internment camps? Grandma, Grandpa, where were you when they were actually beating our African American neighbors just because they were trying to register to vote? Likewise, I hope when our grandchildren ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you when the voiceless and the vulnerable of our world needed leaders of compassion, leaders of grand purpose, and leaders of hope? I hope we can say that we showed up. And maybe it will be the God of history who says to us, "Oh, well done, my good and faithful servant." Thank you very much.